All right, well, good afternoon again, everybody. As Stephanie said, please feel free to get up and get some more food or go to the restroom. But since it's already a little after 12, I'll get started. So where we left off this morning, the United States had formed itself by declaring independence from Great Britain, and we were locked in the middle of a major war against the British Empire. Well, today, or this afternoon, we're going to talk about three key documents: the Declaration of Independence itself and the Articles of Confederation, but our main focus is on the U.S. Constitution itself. But to understand the Constitution, we need to start with understanding the big picture ideas, legal, political, and constitutional ideas that inform the writing of the Constitution itself and the political debate in the United States over whether the Constitution should be ratified and adopted as America's governing document. But before we do that, we have to start with a Constitution that we usually don't talk about very often, which is the British Constitution. So, when Americans declared independence from Great Britain in 1776, the idea of a constitution was not new to them. They often made reference to the then existing constitution, the British Constitution, and the rights and obligations that were contained within it. But here's the thing. If you look in the back of your book, you will not see the British Constitution there.
It's not written down.
Exactly right, Mark. It is not a written constitution. Exactly right. Now, the British Constitution is written down in many different locations, but there is no single written document that's called the British Constitution. So what does that mean? What it means is Britain developed the idea of a constitution over the span of about 700, we're now going on 800 years. Starting roughly with the Magna Carta in 1215. Magna Carta was the first effort to actually write down certain limits on the power of the king. And in the centuries since, additional restrictions were placed on the power of the monarch and of the parliament. But the crucial point here is, in the British constitutional philosophy, statutes, acts passed by Parliament, are part of the Constitution. That is not the way American constitutional law works. Historians have written at length about the American idea of a constitution as it took shape in the 1770s. For our purposes, what's crucial to understand is, from before our Constitution is even adopted, Americans are unique in viewing the Constitution as something that cannot be changed by an act of Congress or by an act of Parliament. The Constitution in the American concept is the structure of government that is voluntarily agreed to by the people themselves to guarantee their rights, individual rights, and to limit the powers of the government, while at the same time consenting to the exercise of certain powers, enumerated powers, by different branches of government. And we're going to put, that's kind of like big picture, 30,000 feet, what we're going to be doing here this afternoon. But that's the heart of it. Well, what that means is, in the U.S. system, the constitutions are overarching form of government. No act of Congress, no law passed by Congress can violate the Constitution. No act of Congress can amend the Constitution. There's only one way to amend the Constitution, and that is through an amendment process. That is fundamentally different than the way the British thought about it. They believe that acts of Parliament themselves are part of the Constitution. And therefore, as we look now at the Declaration of Independence, I want you to keep in mind that when the Americans talk about rights and all the bad things that they believe the Parliament and the King had done to them, that the Americans are operating from the principle that there are certain rights Parliament cannot curtail, or certain powers Parliament cannot assume, because the Constitution trumps the Parliament. That is a unique American idea. It's one they had in 1776. It's one they have in 1789 when they actually adopt the Constitution. And it's one we still have today. One of the things we teach in both civil procedure, mandatory first-year course for law students, and constitutional law, which is also a required first-year course. We emphasize to the students the idea that constitutional law and statutory law are two different things, and that the Constitution always takes precedence over statutes. The Congress is restricted by the Constitution itself. Congress cannot take any action inconsistent with the Constitution. Now here's the catch. How do you figure out if the Congress has acted in violation of the Constitution, or if the, as we're going to see, the executive branch has? Whose job is that today? The Supreme Court, federal judiciary. Exactly right, Mark. Now, as we'll see, when you create a federal judiciary and you instill in it the power to decide what the Constitution says, what the Constitution means, and to interpret statutes, you create a very powerful branch of government. And they understood that in the 1770s and 1780s. And as we'll see, the first crack we took at writing a Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, no judiciary was included in it for that very reason, because of fear about the power of the judiciary itself. Now, everybody, let's start by looking at the Declaration of Independence, because I know you all have it in your books, whatever version you have of it. In mine, it's on page 306. A couple of things. Yes? Tell me your name.
My eighth grade about this like a week ago. I'm Josh.
Josh, yes.
Yeah, I'm Josh. And we talked about how the Federalists and the Democrat Republicans were debating whether it was a literal interpretation or a figurative interpretation. Would you say that that's still kind of like an ongoing thing?
Right.
When we talk about the Constitution and some of the laws, and, you know, the media might say like Obama is violating the Constitution, whether it's literal or figurative?
That's sort of like we talk about that in the context of the Bible. So Josh's question is this divide over how to interpret the Constitution. Do we define it as literally versus figuratively? I'd say no. The Constitution is interpreted literally. I mean, lawyers, we're all about what the words actually say. The dispute, and we'll talk about it especially at the end today, so you have a sense of what's the divide within the U.S. Supreme Court today, or law professors, what have you. The divide is over what the words mean. In figuring out what these words mean, do we look at solely the original meaning of the word? So if Antonin Scalia, he's a justice of the Supreme Court, he's one of the conservatives on the Supreme Court, if he were here, he'd say the way you interpret the Constitution is you read the words, and then and he loves to cite dictionaries, and cite the dictionary meaning at the time. That's what the Constitution means. And then if Justice Stephen Breyer was here, so he's on the liberal end of the Supreme Court, he'd look and say, Justice Scalia's half right. We look at the words in the Constitution, we look at what they meant at the time, and then we look at everything that's happened in the centuries since, and how the Supreme Court's interpreted in different events, and we look at what those words would mean in a modern context. We take into account what it meant in 1787 or 1791. And then we look at everything that's happened since, and we say, okay, in 2016, what does this mean? And Justice Scalia would say, if you want to put 2016's imprint on this, then amend the Constitution. Now, neither side is as extreme operationally, but intellectually, that's their positions.
That's the difference between formal and informal amendments.
Yes, just tell me your name, just so I... Oh, Tim, that's right, Tim.
William Van Alstyne talked about how by reinterpreting to suit your political needs, whichever, and
Right.
it's not a function of a particular political party, but it's kind of a generic thing.
Right.
That using the 2016 twist on those words that were written over 200 years ago
Right.
is, in essence, amending the Constitution without going through the formal process.
Right. Absolutely right. So Tim's point is, well, there's a tremendous amount of power in the judiciary when it comes to interpreting what words mean when we look at it from the perspective of 2016. And that's exactly right. In the real world, everybody does it in the court, because the other problem that we faced is the founders themselves didn't necessarily say what they meant by this in 1787 or 1791. In fact, they were divided, and they were intentionally careful about not having too clear a definition of anything that they were doing, because they had to get this thing ratified. They wanted some wiggle room, and we'll talk about as we look specifically at the Constitution. But the key point here is the one that Tim makes, which is anytime you create a judiciary who's going to be able to look at this and tell us what it means, whatever method they use to interpret it, they've got a tremendous amount of power, because the Constitution is our governing document. If we have a conflict between a U.S. law, a statute passed by Congress, and a constitutional provision, the constitutional provision wins 100 times out of 100. The Constitution is the reigning undefeated champion in American law, okay? Because the whole system is built, like liberals, conservatives, centrists, from 1789 to present. Everyone agrees the Constitution is the final word. The issue, of course, comes down to what does it mean. But we'll get into the details of that in a second. But yes, exactly right. Yes, Brian.
I just kind of wanted to maybe further or interpret a little differently as far as, I guess it seems like I've always been taught as far as, you know, the forefathers were obviously very intelligent, educated group of men. And so it was kind of the way, like they had this understanding that times change. And so they were very deliberate with their wording for the very fact of they knew that this document was going to have to be used for things that they hadn't considered at this point. So they intentionally add that flexibility to address whatever the needs at the time were,
Right.
even stuff that they
Right.
You would quite frankly say, you know, guys, I don't agree with everything that's in here, but we need to still pass that. We need to look through it together, even if we don't agree with it. I think it's a great good. Bigger picture.
Right. That's right.
The intention is there, maybe not Des Moines, Iowa, 2016, but something.
Absolutely right. Though it's also important to keep in mind, in 1787, when they met in Philadelphia, they did not invite the press in to cover what they were doing. It was a secret proceeding. They agreed that no one would take notes. This was the agreement. So they didn't want people to get too deep into what did they really mean by this, because they needed to have flexibility to get this approved, because they knew it was an uphill battle to get the Constitution approved. James Madison violated the terms of the agreement. He secretly kept notes on what they were talking about.
He agreed not to publish till he died. Till all
Yes,
died.
Mark, yes. And in fact, there's a professor at Boston College who's now found evidence that Madison himself changed his own notes. Because he didn't, Madison was more of a pro-Washington figure in 1787. And I mean, he's one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, along with Alexander Hamilton, John Jay. By the early 1790s, politically, he'd moved over to Thomas Jefferson's side. And he did not want to be viewed as someone who was too closely aligned with Hamilton. So the evidence is pretty clear that he doctored his notes so that it looked like he was in a different position than he'd been in 1787, which just gets to the issue. This is a much more challenging problem of figuring out what exactly did they mean. They meant different things at different times. What they meant in 1787 was different than what they meant in 1788 when they were trying to get the thing approved, or 1789 when Washington is our first president, we have our first Congress seated in 1789, and they actually have to implement it. And right out of the gate, they realize there's a problem with the Constitution. In fact, it's pointed out to them immediately by the Anti-Federalists. What's missing? Yes, tell me your name. David. David, yes, no Bill of Rights. And why is that a concern?
Because it kind of limits the government's power over the individual.
Absolutely. What's the argument against? Because they taught at Philadelphia in 1787 when they meet, they do talk about the idea of including a Bill of Rights. And they say, no, we don't want to do it. Why not? Mark?
Too specific.
And why is that a problem?
Because then that's all you get. There's no, you take the interpretation
Right.
They were also kind of tired and ready to go home.
out of it. Yeah, it is.
Right.
They were also
Absolutely.
kind of tired and ready to go home.
Absolutely. They're there from May until September 1787. It's hot. We've got no air conditioning.
What would you-
They're ready to go. Absolutely right. The vast majority of them are far away from home. Most of them obviously are from Pennsylvania. Tim?
Hamilton himself wrote that it would limit the action of the government.
Right.
And he was in favor of a much more centralized power without the dispersed power of the state.
Right, so that even shows, a perfect example, the Federalist Papers. So the Constitution is written in 1787, but just because they wrote it doesn't mean we've actually got a governing constitution. They got to get this thing approved. And you have three people later that year who essentially are writing what's the equivalent of op-eds. John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison writing op-eds. And they didn't all agree necessarily on what's in this document or what it means. So that, again, gives them, one can emphasize one issue, the other can emphasize another. Hamilton wants a strong government. Madison is aligned with him in the fall of 1787, but he's from Virginia. He's already sensitive to the fact that they cannot emphasize the powers in this if they're going to get it approved. Yes, David.